things are going to happen. In the meantime, don't think it's enough to rely on corrections to deal with what is at its root a health issue. And I don't think I need to tell anybody in this room about some of the underlying issues that we have to address as a community, as a country, as a society. There is a reason why we see a disproportionate number of people with mental illness in prisons, and it's not because they're the most serious criminals. We have to deal with that. So, that now is the end of my presentation. That's the website, and I know there's already one question right here.
I'm really not aware of how the prison system works very much, and I'm just wondering, like, what I've seen, like, through television and whatnot, the people get, like, time in the yard and maybe, like, a common area to eat. Does this happen, or is this just plain fiction?
It depends on the prison. I don't know if everybody heard the question or not. What happens inside a prison? What the routine's like? They get time in the yard. They go to a common area to eat. It depends on the prison. There are prisons that you know, there are prisons that look like sort of your worst nightmare of a prison. You know, just great big, tall, thick walls and barbed wire and dark little cells and very little movement. You know, there are yards, but they're concrete walls and asphalt yards. And then there are prisons that look like college campuses, and they're cottages, and they're quite nice. There's a prison I was visiting the other day, and I was actually thinking it would be, you know, if it wasn't a jail, it would be a nice place to be, you know. It was very pleasant. There was even a deer running through the field when I was there. It's still a jail. So it really depends very much on the institution. It depends on the security classification. It depends on the physical structure, how it was built and designed. And it depends on how crowded it is, how busy it is. One of the challenges in federal corrections right now is that prisons are typically dealing with multiple populations. I'll give you an example. It would be, there's a prison, a maximum security penitentiary I was in the East, that had 9 different major gangs inside the prison. And so they actually ran the prison like 9 little mini prisons because they could not mix those populations. So you have 9 different groups that you can't have in the yard at the same time, or in the gymnasium at the same time, or in the food line at the same time, or on pill parade at the same time, because if you did, you'd have a problem. So that restricts movement, and it takes away opportunities that you have for, you know, all kinds of things, all kinds of programming. Yeah?
I'm just wondering, a lot of your presentation discussed male offenders in particular, and you just kind of scratched the surface in terms of the prevalence of mental illness amongst women in federal prisons. You said yourself that self-harming is much more prevalent in a female institution than it is in a male prison.
Yeah.
And yet we have a complex need unit only for men.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to the fact that those services don't exist for women, or do they exist and they're just within the institution itself, or how does that work?
Yeah. The Correctional Service of Canada has 5 standalone women's correctional centers. They're all multi-security level. They also have a healing lodge, a minimum security healing lodge for women federally sentenced in southern Saskatchewan. There's just under 600 women in those centers right now. Women's centers are significantly crowded. We've even seen double bunking and segregation in the women's centers. The incidence of mental illness is higher for women. The incidence of self-harm is higher. The single largest growing population of offenders in Canada are Aboriginal women. Women come to penitentiary with different life histories than men, quite typically. Life histories that are far a greater incidence of personal trauma. Women's involvement with the criminal justice system is often related to other issues, family circumstance, their partner, drug addiction, being involved in crime through others, particularly through intimate others, women who have been involved in the street level drug or sex trade. It's often not their primary source of income, or as much as they are working for somebody. So it's very different.
Why isn't there a complex needs unit for women? If you're saying that they're more likely to self-harm and they have the same, if not more so, complex needs.
Yeah.
How is that not being addressed?
Well, okay, I'm going to give you two answers, okay, and they're both equally correct. One is because the numbers, you couldn't develop that kind of a resource for women because the numbers don't justify it, don't warrant it. The money that you would spend doing that, you could spend much better in terms of moving those women into more appropriate health-focused settings. And so it wouldn't make sense to construct what might become more of a special handling unit, like a supermax, than a complex need or a health focus. So it wouldn't make sense to do that, so you can spend the money better. That's a good answer. There's another answer, which is that it's sort of similar. There's not very many of them, and you know, women's corrections is yes, there's a deputy commissioner for women, but that deputy commissioner doesn't have line authority over the wardens of the women's institutions. They still report up regionally through regional deputy commissioners, and regional deputy commissioners have one women's prison with a couple hundred women, and they have a dozen men's prison with thousands and thousands of prisons, and so kind of guess where their attention is focused. And so that's a good answer too.
I'm wondering if there's a country in the world that's doing a better job than Canada in terms of the proportion of mentally challenged people that are in the prison versus in the community.
There are some good examples of good practice. I'm not sure that anybody's got it, you know, like right according to me. But no, there's some. You know, Norway actually has some very good practice. There is actually some very good practice in the United States, particularly with older offenders. There's some very good practice in Sweden. There's some good practice for women in France. So, you know, all over the world, you can find examples of specific programs, specific initiatives, specific facilities, specialized kinds of training. But I don't think that any one system, you know, I could point to and say, yeah, that's the system that we should be modeled on. I mean, and I you know, I know there's lots of people in the room with first-hand corrections experience, and so you know, you're likely to get different answers from different perspectives. That's just mine.
Can you comment a little bit more on your idea of Correctional Services Canada purchasing provincial health care? Being purchasers of it? And
Yeah.
That model, and have you looked at the cost effectiveness of it?
Yeah, you know, healthcare provision right now is sort of a continuum between, and it goes along the line of something like this. Correctional Services Canada provides everything, to Correctional Services Canada provides nothing. And so in the middle is where we're living right now. So Correctional Services Canada is the largest employer in the country, I think, of psychologists. But when it comes to psychiatrists, you know, there are none. They're under contract, and they, in Ontario region, last time I looked, the one psychiatrist I was looking at had a patient caseload of about 3,000. So, you know, that kind of model, you wonder about how therapeutic those interventions are. Correctional Service of Canada employs a lot of nurses. And the correctional services will probably never be able to totally get out of being an employer of healthcare professionals or providing some, at least, primary care. But along that continuum, there are lots of opportunities to move the care off-site and to deal most appropriately with healthcare issues in healthcare settings. The United Kingdom, a few years ago, moved to where the National Health Service is the healthcare provider inside Her Majesty's penitentiaries. Nova Scotia has co-located a forensic hospital with a provincial correctional center, and there's some interesting experience there. In Ontario, there's the St. Lawrence Treatment Center, which is operated by the Royal Ottawa Hospital Group in terms of forensic facility, but it's also a sentence institution. So there's that model in Brockville to look at. British Columbia Health, BC, is doing a lot of work in this area in terms of integrating the healthcare in the system from a healthcare perspective and having healthcare administration making healthcare decisions. Did I get that even close to right? Yeah.
Alberta too, is just.
Alberta Health, that's right, Alberta Health, in spite of other things you've heard about Alberta, Alberta is also moving in this direction. So the provinces are actually more aggressive on this than the federal government is. And one of the recommendations of ours that the Correctional Service acted on a couple of years ago was to hire outside expertise to look at the continuum of care and to see where there are opportunities for alternative service delivery models. And that report has now been written, and I'm going to be briefed on it sometime next week. So we'll see what their consultants came up with.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering.
Just a second. Then you.
This is more comments than questions, Howard. First of all, your mention of all the psychologists in federal prisons, penitentiaries, and the psychiatrists, the 3,000 caseload. I mean, that's mind-boggling. And I noticed in reports about incidents like the Ashley Smith incident, there are references to the psychologists, and it always bothered me because if it's not a mental health issue in a vague way, but it's actually mental illness, and Ashley Smith was mentally ill. She didn't have mental health issues, she was ill. You need a psychiatrist. And to talk about all the psychologists in the system, the reports seem to indicate, with only passing reference to psychiatrists really bothered me.
Yeah.
So that's, I don't know if you have that same feeling or not.
Well, Ashley never benefited from a complete assessment. That was one of the issues.
Wow.
And there is disagreement amongst clinicians as to what she may have been dealing with, and what the system could have done differently.
Yeah, no, I know that,
So-
but I kept seeing the word psychologist in these
Yeah.
reports, and rarely did I see the word psychiatrist, and I thought the correction system was missing the boat because of its mental illness. They need psychiatrists. Psychologists aren't much help at all. Biological illness in the brain, psychology just goes right by them.